This is the Rich Life podcast. The inspiration of today's podcast, Dr. Pohl wrote a really long list of different strategies on overcoming procrastination. You can find this blog at drpohlwoo.com under his blog section.
I'm excited to talk about this topic because number one, I think it resonates with a lot of our listeners and it certainly resonates with me, right? I got interested in this topic because number one, I see it a lot in my clients. I also see it in myself. I think a lot of us more type A people, but for some reason or other, we put off, right?
We're going to be just having a little discussion going through some of these strategies.
And then just delving into the common causes, and then also what are some practical steps that our listeners can take away from this.
To lead the way, what is something that you're
Yeah,
avoiding?
yeah.
Like what is
So one thing I'm working on right now is I am creating a online workbook as well as an online assessment tool to help folks determine a little bit more about themselves. Specifically, this is a assessment based on the traditional Chinese medicine 5 elements theory, right? And merging that with some neuroscience aspects. So I'm working on an assessment tool where folks can really learn their so-called elemental breakdown, right? And then figure out what their natural strengths and weaknesses are. Once you identify that, then you can find ways to quote unquote fill in the gaps, right? That's what we're after, especially doing this podcast together, is to help folks figure out what are the areas in your life that you want to support so that you can have a real nice rounded life and not just be successful in one area. Okay? And I think one of the very common reasons for procrastination, I notice this in myself, is the tendency to be a bit too perfectionistic, right? So perfectionism is, I think, especially common in high achievers, in type A individuals, or a lot of us who went to professional school where we're taught that we have to master our skills, our craft before we can go out into the real world, so to speak. And I'm curious to know how engineering was for you. While this makes sense in certain aspects, it can actually hold us back. For example, in a lot of entrepreneurship, you don't want to wait until everything's perfect, because if you wait until everything is perfect, you're never going to get started. And
the other guy already made it, right? That's why they
yeah,
call it MVP, minimum viable project. Just get it out the door.
exactly. It's the perfectionism is the opposite of that mindset of just get the minimal viable product out, start to get feedback, and then you can gradually improve it from there. So that's something that I've noticed myself, and my own coach actually had to remind me, right, that, hey, just get something out. And so even though I know this on some level, there's another level of me that is still a bit too perfectionistic for my own good. Right?
Yeah, it goes back to like grade school, like the way that the school system is, there is an correct answer. And if you change your mindset that there is no correct answer and you're going to
Right.
readjust down the road. And that's part of why you hang out with me, right?
Yeah,
I'm Mr.
exactly.
Ready, Fire, Aim,
Yeah.
shoot from the hip, and then readjust from there. I think that's more of the entrepreneur type, but most entrepreneurs tend to be more that direction.
So that's what I've noticed, and I think that's one of the things that I admire about you is that you're someone who takes action, right? Like you don't let any fear of failure get in your way or worry about version one being perfect and the results speak for themselves.
Of course, a much bigger topic that we don't have time to go into is this generality that when you're a kid, you start to develop this ego and you don't want to look
Mm,
like a dummy. My daughter, she don't care. She does all kinds of random stuff. She don't care how people think about her. But
yeah.
most people who find enlightenment, and I'm not there yet, I don't think you're there yet either, try to get to a point where you don't
Yeah.
care what other people think about you.
Totally. And this speaks to one of the other most common causes of procrastination is that it's oftentimes not laziness, right? It's actually fear of failure, or there's some underlying fear. It could be fear of having to confront family members who might disapprove of what you're doing, in addition to fear of being made fun of, being ostracized, just insert the blank. There's usually a fear of something that is the underlying cause of why a lot of folks procrastinate. And then besides fear of failure and perfectionism, projects in themselves can cause analysis paralysis. Sometimes we feel overwhelmed by the size of a project or how complex it is, and the brain just has difficulty figuring out like where the heck do I start? And then the paralysis results from just not knowing where to start, and it's a coping mechanism. So oftentimes folks get stuck in the very beginning.
Going back to your example, you've got your workbook that you're working on.
Yeah.
Maybe as an
Mhm.
example for everybody, maybe break that down and how
Yeah.
are you breaking that down in your head? How are you
Yeah.
wood?
Breaking down tasks or chunking them is an effective strategy, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I will break it down into, okay, today or this morning, I'm going to work on the cover, pick my fonts, pick my images beyond the morning. I can always change it later. Next chunk I had for myself is finish the bio, right? Finish those couple pages, get those pictures in. Next chunk was create one exercise for the workbook. Another chunk would be, all right, let's start to get the online questionnaire in place, right? And that's obviously like a bigger chunk, which I had to break down into many, like mini chunks. Yeah, but breaking down the task so that it's like that saying, if you gotta eat an elephant by just taking one bite at a time, right? You're not gonna get anywhere by thinking about, oh my gosh, I have to swallow this whole thing, right? I also remind myself, I'm using a running analogy, right? Since I've done quite a number of marathons, is that I figured out there's a huge mental component to it, right? So if you, and this applies whether you're an amateur runner or an elite, right? And the mindset is if you start the race and you think, oh my gosh, I have 26 more miles to go, mentally you're going to be toast. You're not going to be able to do it. If you break it down into chunks, right? There's this saying when in running where we say like just run the mile that you're in, right? Run the mile. Once you're finished with the first mile, run the next mile, run the next mile, right? And if a mile is too big of a chunk, then you break it down into even smaller chunks, right? Make it to the next tree, make it to the next lamppost. Just keep moving forward. Take one step forward. And that makes it mentally so much more doable than thinking, "Oh my gosh, I have this enormous task left." What's been your experience like, Jay? Do you like to break things down into chunks?
I follow this getting things done method,
Yeah.
and it's the idea of when you pick up a project, and
Mhm.
I'm sure most of us are working on 35 projects at the same time. If you use Asana, it's probably 150 projects. But before you put it back down, you identify the next step for the next action that you're going to take. If you can take it into 2 minutes, 2 minute rule, people are
Mhm.
familiar with that, you do it. But a lot of times it might take you 15 minutes and you may need to be in the right state. You may need a cup of tea, but I just at least identify that before moving on. So in a way, it is breaking down tasks, but maybe somebody might get even overwhelmed by, my goodness, I need to break it up into 8 to 12 tasks. I'm procrastinating, breaking down my tasks, but maybe just what's the next one? What's the
Mm.
next one? The next one that you got here is setting clear goals. And I think where this is setting up is figuring out what's your why. What is your maybe MVP, minimum viable project? But again, creating that purpose. What is the why behind what you're doing? Did your project change based off of like your vision of your workbook at the end or any other example? The way I see this one is you're trimming off some scope, right? If your end goal is different than what you're trying to do, then just maybe getting there by subtracting of what you need to do.
Yeah, that definitely resonates what you just said, and I find that there is a lot of trimming involved, right? Sometimes I get very into your project, especially if it's something that you're passionate about and you get to be creative, right? For this workbook, I had to remind myself this is not the only thing that I'm going to be making. I don't have to put everything out all at once. Just going back to this idea of minimum viable product, right? Make something that's good and useful, but no one is saying that this has to be the final draft. Right. And yeah, so there are some things that actually I put together that I'm actually not going to include in this workbook, but I'll include in like future assessments or future tools.
I think I did the same thing with my wealth elevator book. Like we
Mm,
got to the final stages and then I get an idea that would probably take up a half a page or a couple
yeah.
pages here. But this guy, I guess, falls in setting clear goals. Like I got okay with the fact that, hey, at some point, 4 or 5 years from now, we'll make expanded edition or we'll make a spin-off PDF or article on this content. I actually made a Word doc of all the things to add into the next edition later on. So I captured the thought. I actually wrote it out where
Mm,
hopefully I've just cut and pasted it in later. That kind of helped me just move the project forward.
yeah. I like that. Yeah, I like
Uh,
that a lot.
the third one here you have is implement time blocking.
Mm,
If people want to Google, I think it's like a little tomato Pandamomo
mm,
timer. Am I saying that right? It's like a tomato timer is the
mm.
idea. The whole idea is you set. I think that there's a couple arrangement in this. Like you work for 20 minutes and you take a break for 10, or there's other strange arrangement of 47 minutes and 13-minute rest. But you do this for several blocks in a row. There's YouTube videos of actual this timer that you can set on your desktop. But it's this idea of sprint, rest, sprint. I'll be honest, I don't do this. I know myself enough that I can go for about an hour half, which is much longer than even the longer of these
Mm.
normal time blocks. Try it out, see what works for you. I don't know. How do you implement time blocking, Paul?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Are you referring to the Pomodoro tech? That one, it's like you set a timer for 20, 25 minutes, and then you work until the timer goes off, and then you take a 5-minute break
I mean, you
after
can
the
even go on
fourth.
Amazon and buy one of these
Mm,
timers. This thing, I've had it for a while and it broke, but it was like a dice,
mm,
a six-sided timer. And based on what side you put it up, that was a timer. So I got the one with the 20-minute, the 5-minute, the
yeah, yeah.
10-minute, just as like a physical thing there. And I've also used like the hourglass. I think it's somewhere, but I don't use these things. And
Yeah, I gotta admit, I also tried the Pomodoro technique, and I think, yeah, just like you, I figured out that sometimes it's useful for getting started, but then sometimes I'm just really on a roll, right? And I'll go longer than the 25 minutes. Yeah, I'll go 45 minutes or even like an hour sometimes. If the creative and the productivity juices are flowing, I'm like, wow, okay, I'm in the zone.
you
Pretty
hit
nice.
those dates.
Yeah,
But I think you said it right there. Like by just starting the timer, you're putting yourself on notice that, hey, it's go time.
right.
I think that's the takeaway I'm taking from this one.
You had mentioned, I think, a few minutes ago, this idea of the 2-minute rule, and that's also like a good, useful tool. And I think that the 2-minute rule states that basically, if you have a bunch of tasks, but you know that the task takes less than 2 minutes to complete, just go ahead and knock it out, right? So this rule helps you tackle all these small tasks in a prompt manner, preventing them from piling up and becoming overwhelming. Yeah, so that's a good rule. I think that's quite useful, and it just prevents all this buildup of these simple tasks, so that you can be in the mind space to tackle these more important projects.
Yeah. And you had it in your blog article as the 5-second rule, but it's same premise, right? Creating a sense of urgency and then
Yeah.
just knocking it out.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah, do a little countdown for yourself if you need to, and just bite the bullet for a little bit and then just knock it out. Yeah.
yeah. And this is where I think you need to have a little patience with other people when you're at your kid's soccer game and you're watching the team mom and team dad not do something where they could just knock it out on their phone in 2 minutes. And you're like, you start to become very aware of these types of things. But these are like the mini hacks that give the game of inches this life is. And if you start to implement these types of things, imagine where you'll be. So next one here, this concept of going pro. Maybe just explain this one to us, Paul.
This one is interesting. I find this useful if you're working on something that's very meaningful to you, right? It assumes that you already have a very strong why, right? You have a clear purpose and clear goals as to why you're doing this. But the premise of going pro is that you basically treat your tasks with the discipline and the routine of a professional, right? So how would a professional do this? Would a professional be inconsistent and not disciplined? No, a professional, if they're doing it, they would do it with consistency, right? And they would hit the ground running so that they get momentum. Just like we were talking before about like, using the Pomodoro method to as a way to get you going, to get you in that flow state, right? Similarly, if we think about things in like a slightly longer time frame, we can also get momentum by being consistent and getting our tasks done early on in a project. And then the more wins that you stack up, the easier it is to keep going and keep stacking, right? So get those little wins early on, and then you're going to be in a much better position to take those bigger chunks, right? And to actually make strides in your progress. Right? Going pro means that you're committing to a regular practice and treating tasks with the same discipline as a professional, right? And treating this seriously, it really reduces the chance of procrastination.
Have you heard of the book by Steven Pressfield, Turning Pro? So it's a very popular author. He's actually written like a few books like this, Turning Pro, The War of Art. But if people
Yeah,
are
yeah.
very type A professionals, I think they're great little books to pick up. And a little bit more, I guess I would call it like a hard ass kind of way. Like I guess maybe in a way when I read it, it reminded me of a doctor. Like you guys say, hey,
Yes.
you're gonna come in, you're gonna apply what you know, and you're gonna practice it. And that's what he says, taking a professional's outlook to the craft. Um,
Exactly.
but and it's on the stoic side, I would say, but definitely very popular book. But I think we're gonna wrap up there. We'll do a second part on this in the coming podcasts, but I think part of this breaking things up, you want to implement some of these productivity hacks from time to time, a little bit at a time. I think we went through maybe about 4 or 5 ideals. Try and implement one or two instead of the game plan. We let off with some mindset stuff, getting over not being perfect. I think that's one of those bottom up tactics that it's going to take a long time to fully embrace. Paul and I obviously we're wearing clothes, so obviously we care what people think about us right now. People listening on the podcast form, check out the YouTube channel. Just kidding, we're not naked. We're all trying to unlearn, trying to protect the ego here. But we'll pause right here and we'll pick up some more of these procrastination productivity tips in a future podcast.